Hi, good morning. Thank you, Aaron, as always, for sharing your pulpit. This morning we've been hearing songs, poems, prayers, and scriptures about the word listen. What does hearing the word listen bring up in you? Let me share with you a story from my own life. And as you listen, pay attention to how you feel. What do you react to? What feels uncomfortable for you? Which role do you identify with in this story, and which one do you push away from? I don't have too many memories from when I was a kid, but one of them is this feeling of anxiety and insecurity and needing to be heard. I remember being in a car and wanting to excitedly interrupt the person talking because I needed to share something, probably a sign we passed by, or a deep thought that I had, or a question, where are we going? To me, those thoughts and ideas were pure gold to be coveted, and it felt crucial to share these things with the ones that I loved most. I wanted to be known and understood. However, if I had interrupted the grown-ups, I'd get shut down, and if I raised my voice to be heard, I would be punished for being disrespectful. And so I often was forced to keep these thoughts to myself. I remember my dad and I one time riding in a car, just the two of us going somewhere. I don't remember where we were going, but I was excited to be going there. I just incessantly kept talking, and as we say, a very professional sounding word, this word vomit was just coming out of my mouth. And my dad responded instead of to what I was saying and said, "Ashley, can you just please be quiet for 5 minutes?" I remember the heartbreak in that moment, shutting me out from conversation and connection, from being known. I had so much life and energy to share, so many experiences that connected objects that I had seen to stories that I knew, people that I had seen or known to situations that I might have seen on the street. I still recall the way I zipped my lips and wanted to just cry. In retrospect, I know my dad did not mean to be cruel. Possibly there just wasn't the capacity for him to contemplate all the things that I was sharing, and maybe he felt I needed a response to every single one. But it still hurts to this day just the same. I can pinpoint this moment as a time when I learned that my dad could not handle all of my words, and that the world did seem much less bright and welcoming to me. I wasn't listened to, no matter how insignificant what I wanted to say seemed, and I've second-guessed myself my whole life. So how did it feel to hear that story? What arose in you? Did you stop listening at any point because it hurt too much? Or maybe you were reminded of a similar situation? Thank you for embracing my story and allowing me to share it. It's a heavy story, and it brings up feelings of inadequacy within me even now, 30 years later. Maybe you have a story similar to mine. Maybe you are a kid or a youth listening now, and this has happened to you. Maybe you were the person on the other end shutting down someone because you felt you couldn't handle what they had to say. Maybe you've tried to speak your truth and been asked to sit down because of it. And maybe you are a person who has continued to speak loudly in the face of opposition. The truth is, neither person in that situation won. Both of us were stripped of potential and agency. The person being shut down, me, lost their voice and questioned my truth. And the one doing the shutting down, the grown-up, lost out on a new perspective, a chance to invite transformation into their lives from a child. And Jesus tells us of a different way in Mark chapters 8 and 9. In verse 14, we catch up with the disciples in a boat with Jesus. We know Jesus spent a lot of time telling of and discussing important things and sharing deep theological truths in a boat. In verse 14, we read, Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And Jesus cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod." And they said to one another, "It is because we have no bread." They're very concerned that they have forgotten this bread. But the bread of life himself reminds them of a higher calling. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. He's warning them that the religious and political leaders were growing in their harmful positions of power and influence. That's what they needed to be worried about. But we see in the next verse that they ignore that and they bring it back to the bread. And I can almost imagine them giving Jesus a blank stare, as if he had interrupted their important conversation about bread, and turning back to one another to continue the conversation, saying, "Well, it's because we have no bread." And Jesus, I'm sure exhausted, responded with this in verses 17 and 18. "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember?" In other words, why are you making this about the bread still? Aren't there bigger things to be concerned about? In verse 19, he goes on to remind them that they had just fed a crowd of 5,000 and fed a crowd of 4,000, and they had plenty of left over. And so he's sending the message home to them. It's not the bread they need to worry about. There's plenty more where that came from. In verse 19, we read, "When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" And they answered, 7. "When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. He said to them, "Do you still not understand? 12 baskets, 7 baskets, that's plenty." So they get to their destination. He heals a blind man, and right after that is what we call Peter's confession in verse 29. After a lengthy discussion about who people say that Jesus is, God asks the disciples directly, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter responded, "You are the Messiah." So it seems like Peter is getting it. We have pretty high hopes for Peter at this point. In verse 31, we begin to see Jesus revealing how he will die at the hand of those who are powerful leaders. He mentioned his resurrection, but that part seems to be ignored. It seems that the storyline of Jesus' death was too much for Peter. He could not handle this part of the story. So he pulls Jesus aside and, as a disciple to the Savior, rebukes Jesus. He cannot believe this is the way, and surely Jesus is wrong. But I think we recognize what Peter is feeling in our own selves. I think he's speaking out of fear. He's hearing something that does not sit well with him. He feels thrown off course. His reality is changing. What he thought was true is not true. It's because he hasn't been listening. We don't know what Peter said to Jesus, but whatever it was something that caused Jesus to identify Peter with Satan. In verse 32 it says, "And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, 'Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things.'" We can imagine that Peter was seeing things through a lens of fear, a fear of the things that Jesus' death might mean for him personally, not for Jesus, and certainly not for the collective good of all of Jesus' followers. Peter was not listening to Jesus, truly listening. If he had been, he would have known there is life that comes after. He skipped listening to the resurrection part. There is life after the deep listening. You can't skip out on the hard stuff, or else you'll miss the life when it comes. Then Jesus responds to the crowd gathered after this conversation with Peter with this. In verse 34, "If any of you wants to be my followers, you must give up your own way. Take up your cross and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake and for the sake of the good news, you will save it. We are really familiar with this verse in the church. And Jesus sends a clear message here. God's way is different. God's way is good news. It is sacrificial and values others over self, and it calls us to see outside of ourselves, to listen, and even especially when it's hard to hear. In fact, we are called to lean into the fear of things that feel too hard, and we are called to continue to lose. That word in that verse really stuck out to me. You will lose it. But it's a different kind of winning. If we want to hang on to our life, we are called to lose it, to spend it on others. We see this concept of losing your life to save it in all four Gospels. So it's a cornerstone of being a Jesus follower. To spend ourselves on someone else means creating the capacity to wrap others in the luxurious blankets of safety that we often want to keep for ourselves. We are moving through this season of Lent, the short time before Jesus would be crucified. It's a time when we deny ourselves in order to see the world around us, where we seek how we need to lose our life to save it. It is a time when we recognize that there are things outside of ourselves that God is up to and that we might have disengaged from. Remember the story I told at the top this morning? I have never shared that with anyone. I've held it in without realizing. When I was writing the sermon, it continued to come to my mind, I believe prompted by the Holy Spirit. I share the sacred story that has shaped me with you. I chose to re-enter into being a vulnerable little girl, believing that you would listen with your whole heart. Thank you for doing that. I wanted to lead by example. Some of you have stories that you want to share, and some of you need to listen to the stories happening around you. How do we listen to one another? How do we make a practice of creating the capacity to hold stories that feel difficult? How do we stop talking about bread and listen to the bread of life? How do we pay attention to the yeast, the growth, instead of just pushing through to the finished product? There's so much truth in this story of Peter today, here for us in this moment. In addition to moving through this season of Lent, we're in the month of celebrating Black history, which, as a reminder, is the history of all of us. We are intertwined in our past, our present, and our future with all communities. And as we have been talking about listening and embracing others' stories, even though they might be hard to hear, they shake our reality of what we think we know is true. Let us take a moment to practice that listening this morning. This is also our kid-centered joyful noise service of the month. And so combining these aspects on this day, I chose to play a video that considers the story of a child that also contains within it something that might feel hard to hear. You've most likely heard this child's name, Ruby Bridges, and perhaps you were even alive when the controversy happened. Bertacan Feingold reads us a story written by a grown-up Ruby Bridges, meant for child readers. And as you hear this story, fully listen to it in order to embrace it, even if it feels difficult. See the humanity in this story. Then let's come back together afterward.